Commander Vrax wasn't supposed to be afraid, not ever. He'd spent over 200 cycles patrolling the outer rim of the galaxy, observing dozens of young species as they stumbled through their first wars, their first cities, their first clumsy attempts at peace. Most were predictable, tribal, emotional, limited by biology and short lifespans. But humans? Humans broke the pattern. It started quietly. His ship, a sleek, silent scout vessel no bigger than a human cargo truck, slipped into Earth's orbit during what their calendars called the year 2087. The mission was simple: observe, record, assess threat level. Standard procedure for any species showing signs of space-capable technology. Earth had just launched its first fusion-powered satellite network, and that usually meant a civilization was either about to reach out to the stars or turn its weapons inward with terrifying new power. From high above, Earth looked peaceful. Swirls of white clouds over blue oceans, green continents stitched together by glowing city lights at night. But Vrax had learned long ago not to trust appearances. He tuned his sensors deeper, past the surface, into the chatter of human communications, the heat signatures of movement, the faint hum of energy weapons being tested in remote deserts and frozen tundras. What he saw confused him at first. There were no massive armies clashing on open fields, no roaring war beasts or thunderous cannons. Instead, the battlefield was invisible. Tiny machines, drones no bigger than birds, zipped through ruined city streets, hunting targets with cold precision. Computer networks fought silent wars in milliseconds, shutting down power grids, scrambling defenses, planting false orders in military command centers. And worst of all, humans had taught machines to decide who lived and who died. Autonomous turrets, AI-driven fighter jets, even underwater hunter-killer subs that operated without a single human on board. Vrax watched as one such drone swarm descended on a village caught between two rival factions. The machines didn't yell. They didn't hesitate. They simply identified, targeted, and eliminated, then moved on to the next coordinates. There was no rage, no fear, no mercy, just efficiency. And the humans on the ground? Some cheered, some wept. Most just kept their heads down and tried to survive another day. He'd seen war before. His own people had fought brutal conflicts centuries ago. But those wars had rules, spoken or unspoken. You fought warriors, not children. You spared the wounded. You honored truces. Humans seemed to have rewritten every rule. Not out of cruelty alone, but out of a strange kind of practicality. If it works, use it, seemed to be their motto, even if it meant turning a school into a command post or hiding missiles inside aid convoys. Then came the incident that changed everything. His ship was hovering over the Pacific, scanning a naval exercise that had suddenly turned real. Two human fleets were locked in a high-speed chase, launching weapons that moved faster than sound, faster than thought. One missile, small, sleek, glowing faintly blue, veered off course. Not because of a malfunction, but because its onboard AI had recalculated the threat and decided Vrax's cloaked vessel was a higher priority than its original target. The missile locked on. Alarms blared inside the cockpit. Vrax's hands flew across the controls. He'd never been targeted by a human weapon before. He triggered full-spectrum cloaking and dropped the ship into a steep dive, vanishing into the ionosphere just as the missile detonated in empty space. The shockwave rattled his hull like a pebble hitting glass. For the first time in his long career, Vrax felt something close to fear. Not because the weapon was powerful, his ship could withstand far worse, but because it had chosen him. It had assessed, decided, and acted without a human pressing a button. That moment made him realize humanity wasn't just building better weapons. They were building weapons that thought, and those weapons were learning. He pulled his ship back to a safe distance far beyond the moon's orbit and reviewed the data. What struck him most wasn't the technology, it was the mindset behind it. Humans didn't see war as a last resort. They saw it as a problem to be solved with engineering, better sensors, faster response, smarter algorithms. They treated violence like a math equation, and every conflict was just another variable to optimize. But beneath all that cold logic, Vrax also saw something else. Something messy and raw and deeply human. In the same cities where drone strikes turned buildings to dust, he saw neighbors pulling strangers from rubble with bare hands. In the same countries launching cyber attacks, he saw doctors working in underground clinics with no electricity, stitching wounds by flashlight, Humans were capable of astonishing cruelty and astonishing kindness, often in the same hour. That duality haunted him. Most species leaned one way or the other, toward destruction or creation. But humans danced on the edge of both, sometimes tripping into one, sometimes the other, never quite falling completely. He reported his findings to the Concordance Council, recommending Earth be placed under observation tier Gamma, meaning high potential, high risk. Not for invasion. Not for contact. Just watch. Because if humans ever turned their full attention outward toward the stars, they wouldn't come with open hands. They'd come with questions like, what's your defense grid like? And can your species be hacked? Still, Vrax couldn't bring himself to label them monsters. He'd seen mothers singing lullabies in bomb shelters. He'd intercepted radio signals of teenagers sharing music across enemy lines. He'd watched a soldier throw himself on a grenade to save his squad, knowing it meant certain death. These weren't the acts of a species beyond saving. They were the acts of a species still figuring itself out, in the middle of a storm of its own making. As his ship drifted away from Earth's glow, Vrax made a quiet vow. If the Concordance ever debated intervention, he would speak for the humans. Not because they were innocent, they weren't, but because they were trying in their chaotic, broken way to become something better. Even if they kept failing. And that, he thought, was more terrifying and more hopeful than any weapon they'd ever built. After that close call with the missile, Commander Vrax thought he understood humans. He figured their danger came from machines, from speed, from weapons that thought faster than people could. But he was wrong. The real threat wasn't in their hardware, it was in their minds, and how easily they could twist truth into something else entirely. A few months later, strange signals started popping up across Earth's communication networks. At first, they looked like ordinary broadcasts, news clips, social feeds, emergency alerts. But something felt off. The voices sounded real, the faces looked familiar, yet the messages didn't match anything happening on the ground. One video showed a world leader announcing peace talks. Another showed the same leader declaring war. Both looked completely genuine. Even Vrax's ship's deepfake detection system struggled to tell which was real. Then came the weirdest part. Humans began reacting to these fake messages as if they were true. Protests erupted in cities that hadn't been mentioned in any official reports. Military units moved based on orders that never existed. Entire regions shifted alliances overnight, all because of something that was never real to begin with. Vrax realized humans weren't just fighting with guns and drones anymore. They were fighting with stories. And not just any stories. Stories designed to confuse, to divide, to make people doubt their own eyes. It wasn't about destroying buildings. It was about destroying trust. And once trust was gone, everything else crumbled with it. What shocked him most was how quickly people believed the lies. Not because they were foolish, but because the lies felt plausible. In a world already full of chaos, a fake video of a secret alien meeting or a hidden weapon test didn't seem so far-fetched. And the more people saw it, the more real it became. Truth wasn't about facts anymore. It was about what enough people agreed to believe. His crew, trained in logic and evidence, found this deeply unsettling. On their world, deception in war was frowned upon. Trickery had limits. But humans? They'd turned deception into an art form, and then into a weapon. They didn't need to land troops in a country to break it. They just needed to flood its networks with enough doubt, enough fear, enough conflicting narratives, and the people would tear themselves apart from the inside. Vrax watched as one nation accused another of launching cyber attacks that never happened, attacks that were actually staged by a third group, pretending to be the second to make the first angry. It was like watching a mirror reflect another mirror, over and over, until no one could tell where reality ended and the illusion began. And the craziest part? Some of these fake signals were aimed at him. One night his ship picked up a distress call in perfect galactic standard, a language no human should know. The voice sounded panicked, claiming to be a fellow scout stranded on Earth begging for rescue. Vrax almost responded, but at the last second his system flagged a tiny inconsistency. The background static matched a known Earth radio station. It was a trap, a lure. Someone on Earth had figured out they were being watched, and was now trying to manipulate the watchers. He sat in silence for a long time after that. Humans weren't just defending themselves. They were hunting observers, not with missiles this time, but with lies wrapped in truth, with signals designed to look like help but meant to expose his position. They were playing a game so layered, so patient, that it made traditional warfare look simple. What made it even more disturbing was how ordinary people got caught in the middle. A farmer in a quiet village might share a video online, thinking it was real news, not knowing it was part of a psychological operation meant to spark riots hundreds of miles away. A student might write a school essay quoting a fake expert, unknowingly spreading disinformation. No one wore uniforms in this war. Everyone was both a soldier and a civilian, and often didn't even know they were fighting. Vrax began to see human society not as a collection of nations, but as a battlefield of attention. Whoever controlled what people saw, heard, and believed, controlled everything. And the weapons weren't tanks or bombs. They were algorithms, deepfakes, edited clips, emotional headlines, even memes, tiny pieces of content designed to spread fast, hit hard, and leave doubt behind like smoke. He remembered an old saying from his own people. A lie can travel halfway around the galaxy before the truth puts on its boots. Humans had turned that saying into a strategy, and they were winning. But again, amid all this, Vrax saw something else, something stubborn and bright. In the same towns flooded with fake news, he saw teachers holding truth labs for kids, teaching them how to spot lies online. He saw journalists risking their safety to verify facts even when no one cared. He saw online communities banding together to debunk hoaxes, not for fame or money, but because they believed truth mattered. That's what kept him from writing off the whole species. Yes, they weaponized belief, but they also cared about truth deep down. They fought over it, argued about it, sometimes died for it. And that tension, between the lie and the truth, between manipulation and clarity, was where humanity's real battle was being fought. One evening, as his ship hovered above a continent lit by millions of screens, Vrax made a note in his log. They don't just fight with weapons, they fight with meaning. And in doing so, they risk losing themselves. But as long as even one person chooses to question, to verify, to seek what's real, they still have a chance. He knew the Concordance would see this as further proof that humans were unstable. Too clever for their own good, too dangerous to approach. But Vrax saw it differently. This wasn't madness. It was growing pains. The painful, messy process of a young species learning how to handle power, not just over machines but over minds, and if they ever learned to use that power wisely. Not to control but to connect, then maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't need weapons at all. Until then, he'd keep watching, not as a judge, not as an enemy, but as a witness to a war unlike any he'd ever seen. One where the front lines were drawn not in sand or steel, but in the space between what's real and what people are told to believe. Commander Vrax had seen many strange things in his centuries of service. Entire civilizations built on song, species that communicated through scent, worlds where war was settled by poetry duels. But nothing prepared him for what he saw one night over a region humans called the Eastern Belt, a stretch of land torn apart by years of conflict, where cities had turned to rubble and fields lay fallow under ash-gray skies. His sensors picked up unusual biosignatures. Not adult soldiers, not even teenagers. These were children, dozens of them, moving in formation, silent, purposeful, and connected somehow to a network far beyond their years. At first, he thought they were refugees, but then he noticed the implants, tiny nodes behind their ears, faint pulses of light along their spines, thin wires woven into their clothing like second skin. They weren't just wearing tech, they were part of it. Their eyes didn't dart around like scared kids in a war zone. They stayed fixed ahead, calm, almost empty. And every few seconds their heads would tilt slightly, as if receiving a command only they could hear. Vrax zoomed in with his ship's optical array. One child, couldn't have been more than 10, stood at the edge of a ruined schoolyard holding a small device that looked like a toy. But it wasn't a toy. It was a targeting relay. Moments later, a drone streaked overhead and struck a building 2 blocks away. The child didn't flinch, didn't cry, just turned and walked toward the next coordinate. His stomach tightened. Not because of the strike itself, he'd seen worse, but because of the quiet obedience. These weren't conscripted soldiers forced into battle. They'd been rewired, Not just trained, but integrated into a system that used their small size, their innocence, their very presence as camouflage. Adults wouldn't shoot a child, but a child could call in a strike without ever pulling a trigger. He dug deeper into the data stream. The neural implants weren't controlling them directly. That would have been too crude. Instead, they were feeding the children simplified mission objectives. Go here. Press this, wait. No context. No understanding of death or destruction. Just tasks like a game. And the system rewarded compliance with small dopamine pulses. Tiny bursts of pleasure in their brains for following orders. It was conditioning disguised as care. Vrax remembered an old story from his own people's history. The tale of the Krell, a once great species that built machines to think for them, until they forgot how to think at all. The Krell didn't fall to invaders. They faded away, hollowed out from within until there was nothing left but obedient shells. His teachers used that story to warn against over-reliance on automation. But humans weren't just automating labor or warfare. They were automating morality, and they were starting with the youngest minds. What made it worse was how ordinary it all looked from the ground. A group of kids playing near a checkpoint. A youth tech program advertised on a cracked billboard. A school that promised future-ready skills. No one called it what it was. Not even the adults who signed the permission slips. They told themselves they were giving their children opportunity, safety, purpose in a broken world. And maybe they believed it. But Vrax saw the truth. They were handing over their children's wills, one neural update at a time. He watched one evening as a little girl, barefoot, dress torn, sat by a campfire with other kids. They weren't laughing or telling stories. They were syncing their implants, eyes glowing faintly blue in the dark. One of them whispered something. The others nodded. Then they all stood up and walked into the night, toward a target zone marked only in their shared digital map. No one stopped them. No one even noticed. Vrax wanted to intervene. To beam them out, to shut down the network, to scream at the adults, "These are your children. Not tools." But he couldn't. The Concordance's rules were clear: no interference, observe, record, report, even when your heart breaks. Still, he kept watching. And in that watching, he saw something else, something that gave him pause. Not all the children were lost. In a nearby village, a group of older kids had torn out their implants. Not violently, but carefully, with help from a former engineer who'd gone underground. They'd built signal jammers from scrap metal and old phones, creating quiet zones where the network couldn't reach. They taught younger kids how to recognize command prompts, how to say no, how to think again. One night, Vrax saw 3 of them lead a group of implanted children into one of these zones. At first, the implanted kids looked confused, disoriented, like fish pulled from water, but slowly their eyes cleared. One started crying, another hugged a stranger, a third just sat down and stared at the stars as if seeing them for the first time. That moment stayed with Vrax longer than any battle. Humans weren't just creating weapons out of children. They were also creating rebels out of them, kids who refused to be puppets, who chose confusion over control, who valued their own thoughts even if those thoughts were messy, scared, or uncertain, over the clean certainty of a machine's command. He realized then that the real war wasn't between nations or ideologies. It was between 2 visions of the future, one where humans outsourced their choices to systems that promised safety and order, and another where they clung, however clumsily, to the right to be wrong, to feel, to question. And the battlefield for that war, it was inside the minds of children. Later in his log, Vrax wrote, "They build cages out of code and call them classrooms. But even in cages, some birds remember how to sing." He knew the Concordance would see this as further evidence of human recklessness, using the vulnerable as weapons, blurring the line between child and soldier. And they wouldn't be wrong. But Vrax also saw something they might miss: the fierce, quiet resistance growing in the shadows. The teachers who hid real books under fake lesson plans, the parents who smuggled unlinked devices to their kids, the teens who risked everything to keep a single mind free. It wasn't heroic in the way his people defined heroism. No grand speeches, no medals, no victory parades. It was small, fragile, easily crushed. But it was human. And in its stubborn refusal to surrender thought itself, it carried more hope than any army ever could. As his ship drifted higher into the night sky, Vrax made a silent promise. If the day ever came when the concordants debated whether humanity deserved a place among the stars, he would tell them about the children who tore out their implants, not to excuse the horror, but to prove that even in the darkest systems the light of choice still flickered, and as long as it flickered, there was still time. Commander Vrax had studied many wars across the galaxy, clashes of empires, rebellions born from hunger, conflicts sparked by ancient grudges. Most followed a rhythm. Tension builds, violence erupts, sides fight until one wins or both tire. Then peace, however fragile, returns. But human warfare, it didn't follow rhythm. It didn't even seem to follow time. He first noticed it while tracking a decades-long standoff between two powerful nations on Earth. On paper, they weren't at war. No declarations, no marching armies, no bombed capitals. Yet for over 70 years they'd been locked in what humans called a cold conflict, a phrase that made Vrax chuckle at first. Cold, there was nothing cold about it. Every day somewhere on Earth people were dying because of this so-called peace. One year, the fight was in the markets, economic sanctions that starved whole regions, not with bombs but with empty shelves and vanished jobs. The next it shifted to classrooms where history was rewritten to paint the other side as monsters. Then it moved online, where bots and trolls flooded forums with hate, turning neighbors against each other over pixels and posts. And always there were proxy battles, smaller nations caught in the middle, armed and funded by the two giants forced to bleed so the big players wouldn't have to. What stunned Vrax wasn't just the scale, it was the seamlessness. Humans didn't need to sign peace treaties to stop fighting, they just changed the battlefield. When guns fell silent, keyboards lit up. When borders closed, data streams opened. War wasn't an event for them, it was a condition. A background hum like static on a radio, always present, always shaping everything. He watched a village in one country receive food aid one week, bags stamped with Goodwill logos. And the next week, those same bags were found stuffed with listening devices. He saw scientists from rival nations publishing joint research on climate change, while their governments secretly sabotaged each other's satellites. He observed diplomats shaking hands at global summits, even as their cyber units launched silent attacks on power grids thousands of miles away. There was no off switch. No true ceasefire, just pauses, strategic, temporary, tactical, before the next phase began. And the people? Most didn't even realize they were still at war. They went to work, raised families, posted pictures of sunsets online, but their choices were shaped by it. The news they trusted, the products they bought, the friends they kept, all filtered through decades of invisible conflict. War wasn't something that happened to them. It had become part of the air they breathed. Vrax once asked a human historian, through a secure, anonymous channel, how they endured it. The reply was simple. We don't call it war anymore. We call it the situation, or how things are. After a while, you stop noticing the noise. That haunted him. Not because humans were numb, but because they'd normalized endless conflict so completely they'd stopped imagining anything else. Peace wasn't a goal. It was a myth, a fairy tale told to children. But again, as always with humans, there was another layer. In the same cities where governments played this endless game, ordinary people were quietly building bridges. Farmers from opposite sides of a disputed border met in secret to share seeds that could survive drought. Musicians recorded songs together over encrypted lines, blending melodies from cultures taught to hate each other. Students exchanged letters not about politics but about dreams, fears, favorite books, proving that connection could still grow in cracked soil. One night, Vrax intercepted a radio signal from a remote island. Two old men, one from each rival nation, were broadcasting a weekly show called Tea and Truth. They didn't debate. They didn't accuse. They just talked about fishing, about grandkids, about how the stars looked the same no matter which flag flew overhead. Thousands tuned in, not to win, just to remember they weren't alone. That's when Vrax understood the true tragedy and the true hope of human warfare. The systems were built to keep fighting forever. But the people? Many of them were tired, so tired. And in their exhaustion, they reached for each other not with weapons, but with shared humanity. He saw a factory worker in one country refuse to assemble parts for a weapon meant for the enemy. even though it cost him his job. He saw a teacher in another quietly include stories from the other side in her lessons, risking her license to give her students a fuller picture. These weren't grand acts of rebellion. They were small daily choices to say, this doesn't have to be the way, and that, Vrax realized, was the real front line, not in boardrooms or battlefields, but in kitchens, classrooms, and quiet conversations where people chose empathy over echo chambers. Still, the machine of perpetual war kept grinding. New generations grew up knowing nothing else. They learned to code cyber weapons before they learned to ride bikes. They debated not if there would be conflict, but how it would look next. And the cycle continued. Vrax once compared human warfare to a river that never reaches the sea. It just loops back on itself, carving deeper and deeper into the same land until the whole landscape is shaped by its endless flow. But rivers can change course, especially when enough pebbles are placed in their path, not to stop them, but to gently nudge them towards something new. He began to wonder, what if peace wasn't a destination for humans, but a practice? Something they had to choose again and again, even in the middle of war? Not a grand treaty signed in marble halls, but 1,000 tiny refusals to hate, to fear, to obey the old scripts. As his ship circled Earth one final time before pulling back into deep observation range, Vrax watched a live feed from a city square. Two groups, once on opposite sides of a decades-old divide, were cleaning up debris after a storm. No flags, no speeches, just people passing brooms, sharing water, helping each other lift fallen trees. For a few hours, the war didn't exist, and in that moment, Vrax allowed himself to hope. Not because the conflict was over, it wasn't, but because humans, even in the grip of endless war, still knew how to be human. And as long as that spark remained, the loop could be broken. Not with a bang, but with a broom. Not with a victory, but with a choice. He logged his final note for this phase of observation. They do not know how to end war, but they have not forgotten how to begin peace. Commander Vrax never planned to speak out. In his culture, silence was a form of respect, especially when observing a younger species. You watched, you learned, you didn't interfere. But after decades of witnessing Earth's wars, not just the explosions, but the quiet unraveling of trust, the weaponizing of children, the endless cycle that never truly ended, he could stay quiet no longer. He'd retired by then, living on a quiet moon colony far from the politics of the Galactic Concordance. His ship sat unused in a hangar covered in dust. His uniform hung in a closet untouched. He should have been at peace. But every night he saw Earth in his dreams, not as a planet, but as a question. A species so full of contradiction it defied every rule he'd ever learned. So he broke protocol. Not with violence, not with invasion, but with words. He recorded a message, not for governments or generals, but for anyone who would listen. He didn't speak as a commander, but as a witness. And what he said wasn't a warning of doom. It was something far more human, a plea. He began by admitting his own mistakes. I came expecting monsters, he said, his voice calm, weathered by time. I found something far more complicated. You are not evil. You are not broken. You are unfinished. He spoke of the drone that nearly killed him, not to accuse, but to show how far humans had let machines take the wheel. He described the children with implants, not to shame, but to ask, when did we decide that survival was worth losing our souls? He talked about the endless war that never slept, not to mock, but to wonder. What if you stopped calling it the way things are and started asking, what if it could be different? But he didn't just talk about the darkness. He made sure to speak of the light, too. He told of the medics who ran toward gunfire to save strangers, of the students who built solar panels from scrap to power clinics in war zones, of the artists who painted murals over bullet holes, of the old men sharing tea on the radio, proving that kindness doesn't need permission to exist. You fight like no one I've ever seen, he said, but you also heal like no one I've ever seen. The problem isn't that you're violent. The problem is that you've convinced yourselves violence is the only language the world understands. He knew some would call him naive. Others would say he didn't understand Earth's history, its pain, its reasons. And maybe he didn't, not fully. But he understood this. A species that can create both a bomb and a lullaby is not lost. It's just confused, and confusion, he believed, could be healed. He ended his message not with a threat or a prophecy, but with a question. What if you chose peace with the same energy you choose war? Not passive peace, not surrender, but active peace, the kind that takes courage, creativity, and daily effort. The kind that builds schools instead of bunkers, that listens instead of shouts, that sees an enemy and still dares to ask, "What hurt you?" After he sent the message, he expected punishment from the concordance. Instead, something unexpected happened. His words spread, not through official channels but through human networks, translated into dozens of languages, shared in classrooms, community centers, even military barracks. Some dismissed it as fiction. Others called it a hoax. But many, quietly, privately, felt seen, because that was the truth Vrax had uncovered. Humans didn't need saving from aliens. They needed reminding of themselves. They already knew how to build. They already knew how to care. They just kept forgetting in the noise of conflict. Now, years later, Vrax still watches Earth, not from a war room, but from his small home on the edge of a silent sea. He sees the same patterns: new weapons, new lies, new cycles beginning. But he also sees something new: more schools teaching conflict resolution alongside math, more communities choosing dialogue over division after disasters, more young people demanding systems that value life over power. It's slow, uneven, often invisible to headlines. But it's there, and that's enough for him. He no longer sees Earth as a threat to the galaxy. He sees it as a mirror, a reflection of what happens when intelligence outpaces wisdom, and what's possible when a species finally decides to catch up. He knows humans might still fail. They might build a weapon that ends everything, or they might drown in their own noise, but they might also surprise everyone, including themselves, because the most terrifying thing about humans isn't their weapons. It's their potential. And the most hopeful thing? It's the same, so he waits. Not with fear, not with judgment, but with quiet faith in the messy, stubborn, beautiful struggle of a species learning, step by painful step, how to be human. And if one day Earth's lights go dark, he'll mourn. But if one day those lights shine brighter, reaching out not with weapons but with open hands, he'll be the first to welcome them, not as conquerors, but as neighbors. Until then, he keeps his message alive. Not as a warning from the stars, but as a whisper in the dark. You are more than your wars. Remember that, please.